I also speak Russian and English. And I've known Vadim for about 5 years. He came to Penn State with his Vysotsky project, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, performing the songs by Vysotsky in his English translation. And 2 years later, he came back with his equally impressive Mayakovsky project, which was the bilingual video of the Clouded Pants. And it was then, that was in fall of 2019, I think we had lunch together. And I sort of said, "Oh, Vadim, what are you working on now?" And then he sort of sheepishly said, "Well, I'm translating Faust." Really? Wow. I was kind of taken aback because, first of all, why Faust? That seems to me like. And also, I didn't think Vadim knew German. So maybe I'm mistaken. So, well, Vadim, you know German then? And he said, "No, I don't know German." I said, "Well, then how can you translate Goethe without knowing German?" And then he explained to me his method, which is really quite amazing. So what Vadim did, well, he took the German text, German original, and ran it through Google Translate. So that was one step, and to get this sort of, literal but weird English version. He compared it with several English rhymed translations, and most importantly, he also consulted Boris Pasternak's magisterial Russian verse translation of Goethe. And Pasternak is probably known to many of you as the author of the novel Dr. Zhivago, but he was actually one of the greatest Russian poets of the 20th century and a very prolific translator of lyrics. More or less unwillingly, he was forced by the Soviet government to translate to make a living. But he did this very great translation of Faust from the 1930s. So what Vadim did, he just compared all these different, sort of triangulated, and then came up with his own version, which is actually quite different from all, but inspired by, or at least that's how he explained it to me. I thought he sounded crazy, to be honest, but I was kind of curious, so I said, "Tell me more about it." And afterwards, we had this correspondence via email for several months, where we sort of talked about this project, and he sent me drafts of his translation that I looked at and critiqued and sort of compared with the German and on and such. And I'm happy to say that sort of an edited version of our email correspondence is actually going to get published next year in the Journal of Multilingual Literature, with the title "Faust in 3 Languages, or How to Translate Goethe Without Knowing German." So, among other things, we talk in this conversation about how we both encountered Faust for the first time as teenagers. So in Vadim's case, obviously, he read Faust in the Pasternak translation and fell in love with it immediately. He told me that was his favorite book for many years. I also encountered Faust as a teenager, but it was rather different. I had to read it in school because I grew up in German-speaking Switzerland. This was mandatory reading in high school. Like with anything that sort of force-fed to you in school, I sort of balked at it, and I didn't really see the greatness of it. Even though I remember, even back then, I thought there were some great lines in there, but it just seemed kind of too long, especially the part 2, which is actually, interestingly, what Vadim likes better than part 1. So I only sort of rediscovered Faust, frankly, maybe 10 years later, when I was a graduate student at Columbia University, not too far from here, and I had to teach literature humanities, which is a required course for Columbia freshmen, and Faust was on the reading list for that course, so I had to reread Faust, and I sort of said, "Wow, this is actually more interesting than I remember," but I had to teach it in English translation, not in German, and that was immensely frustrating to me, because the translation we used was sort of a workmanlike, more or less literal, translation. I told you what the German text said, but no attempt to keep the music, the rhymes, or the humor. And all the time I told my students, believe it or not, this is actually funny when you read it in German. You wouldn't believe. But when you have to explain a joke, you kill it, right? So that was dead. So, and the only saving grace of this edition was that it was a bilingual edition. So it had the German text on the left side. So more often than not, I just ended up reading to them the German text, even though they didn't know German. I said, just listen. Maybe you don't understand the words, but listen to the music. Because Goethe is an absolutely amazing poet in German. Really, I mean, he's like on the level of Pushkin, for those of you who know Russian, or Shakespeare if you know English. He uses the German language like a virtuoso on an instrument. He makes the language sound amazingly with all these rhymes and meter. And of course, a translation has to somehow at least try to capture that. So how does Vadim's translation compare to reading Goethe in the original? I guess I'm the one who can answer that question for you. It's obviously not the same, but that's not amazing because no translation is ever the same as the original. It is funny though, just like Goethe is funny, and it has music, and that's very important. It is more accessible, I think, to American readers than it would be to a German reader, than Goethe is to a German or Swiss reader today, because after all, Goethe's text is 200 years old. So it has aged a little bit. Even though contemporary German, it's not that different from Goethe's German, but still. Whereas Vadim's English, you'll see it's completely a standard American spoken slang. So he has translated Goethe into the spoken American vernacular of today. So it has expressions in there like going bonkers, or the no chance in hell and things like that. That makes it very colloquial. It's also racier, I think, than the German original. I just would like to give you one of my favorite examples. I don't know whether that's in the film or not, but I just wanted to show it to you. Sort of give you an example. So this is a scene at the court of the emperor. There's a young page who is very frustrated because the ladies don't pay attention to him because they think he's too young for them. So he talks to Mephistopheles, and Mephistopheles gives him an advice. Well, that's what he says in Vadim's translation. You chase the young ones. My advice is stop. Try cougars. They're bound to eat you up. So I read it and said, wow, that Goethe wrote that? I didn't pay attention to that in high school. So I scurried to the German original to see what does Goethe actually say. So here is what Goethe says. Müsst euer Glück nicht auf die Jüngste setzen, die Angejagten wissen euch zu schätzen. Which means in English, you should not stake your happiness on the youngest. Those advanced in age know how to appreciate you. So it's the same meaning, but you can see it phrased quite differently. So out of curiosity, I also went to Pasternak, because so let's see what Pasternak does with that. And you could easily find, if you know Russian, you could easily find him online, because Russians don't believe in copyrights. So here's the same passage with Pasternak.
Оставьте пожилых и их причуды,
Оставьте
молодых и
их причуды.
Для пожилых вы лакомое блюдо.
Yeah, для пожилых лакомое блюдо. So for those of you who don't know Russian, leave the young ones alone, at their whims alone. For the old ones, you are a tasty dish. So you see how it sort of evolved from Goethe, who's just sort of talking about the content, but not particularly racy, and then we have the tasty dish, and then that becomes the cougar who is going to eat you up. But you also see how Vadim is not simply translating Pasternak or Goethe, it's really his own version, somehow inspired. So Pasternak is there in the DNA somehow of your translation. It's sort of like a crypto text in a third line. So I find it's highly unusual and highly fascinating. I've never seen anything like that before. So I think somebody should write a PhD thesis about this at some point. Maybe I'll find a graduate student who's going to analyze your,
Send them my way.
Yeah. So, but Eric, also pay attention to the rhymes, because they're really, if you indulge me for another moment, the rhymes are one technical challenge that you face when you translate German or Russian poetry into English are the so-called feminine rhymes. So feminine rhymes are when you have a stressed syllable followed by an unstressed syllable. They come quite easily in German and in Russian. And usually what German and Russian poets do, they alternate between masculine and feminine rhymes. Masculine rhymes, you just end on a stressed syllable. In English, about 90% of all rhymes are masculine. So finding feminine rhymes is quite a challenge. And Vadim does that frequently with compound rhymes. So like curtsy hurts me, milieu will you, museum see him, memorandum understand him, naked take it, tease us geezers, Menelaus slay us, Victor tricked her, and so on. So these rhymes are actually quite funny. So when you read it, it makes you laugh. They're not in Goethe and they're not in Pasternak. So this is, I think, Vadim's contribution to Faust, is this funny compound rhymes. And obviously, I think this is meant to be performed. This is meant to be read aloud. And that's what Vadim also explained to me. Same with his Vysotsky, it's meant to be sung, right? And that's why rhymes and music and melody is so important, and I think you really captured that brilliantly. And I'm really looking forward to seeing that now staged in a film. You know, as I think you mentioned already, Faust is actually rarely staged. Certainly part 2, I've never seen it on stage. But Goethe himself was a theater person. He was a director of a theater. I think Goethe himself would be very happy with what you did. So thank you very much.